Okay, welcome back to the next part of this tutorial. So where we left off last time, we managed to get one mesh to boolean this shape out of the other one, and we got it all crunchy like this, and it's pretty cool. It doesn't have any collision, and it's also not dynamic. It's doing this just with a box and a sphere right now. So that's the two things we're going to look at in this video. Now, it's worth discussing that this is an experiment at this point, that we're just kind of learning how geometry script works and looking at different things we can do with it, trying to get some inspiration. If this were a proper system design, we would have a game that we were working towards, and we would have certain parameters that would come out of that. So, yes, we're trying to create an impact crater, but if we knew what kind of game it was, we would know what kind of impact crater we want to make. We would know what kind of parameters we can feed into that. We'd also know how much system performance we can eat up for this particular impact crater, which is going to be kind of a big deal as we move forward with this. So just try and keep that in mind. This is the experimental phase, this is the sort of messing around phase, which is really good for system designers to do, but it's not actual system design of like trying to achieve what we want from the game. Okay, so this is still just kind of experimental stuff. But we can tell that this is a good start, but it needs collision, and it needs to be dynamic, and it needs to be set up in a way that game designers might kind of use in a game. So let's take a look first at the collision problem. So if we go back to our actor here. Now collision, so we spoke last time about how we have a dynamic mesh component, and then we have a dynamic mesh, and the mesh is within the component. Okay, now collision is actually held on the component, and so one of the first things we can do is we can take our box mesh component, let's drop that down here, and let's just set collision, scroll up here, set collision enabled, which doesn't set the collision enabled, it sets whether the collision is enabled, and you'll see here it defaults to no collision. Let's put it to query and physics, collision enabled. So as we go back in here, well, there's still no collision. Okay, so that didn't work. So why didn't that work? Well, it didn't work because that mesh component doesn't know what to build collision out of. This is one of the common things I see with students when they're working with systems like this for the first time. It seems obvious to me, to you, to everyone in the world, that if you're a dynamic mesh component and we ask you to turn on collision, you're turning collision on your dynamic mesh. But this is a computer, this is a system, it does not have that kind of, there's no common sense in computers, okay? There's only the actual literal maths and logic that we give it. So, preferably before we turn on collision, I don't think it makes a big difference what order we do this in, but we move this over. We are going to need our box mesh component. Now, again, we're learning geometry script as we go here. One of the things we could do is we could look up the API, we could look up blah blah blah. But one of the great things about Unreal is that when we drag stuff off of a pin, we drop it, this is context sensitive. Okay, so this will show us stuff that is only relevant to what we've just dragged away from. And if I type in collision, okay, so we've got variables collision, we've got dynamic mesh component, that's what we want. We've got collision, let's see, get for, let's drag up here, geometry script collision, look at that, set dynamic mesh collision from mesh. So, And it's not a very helpful title because when you drag it out, it's set dynamic mesh collision from mesh, but it's actually from a dynamic mesh. So this here, like we said before, down here with the sphere, the target mesh that comes out of here is the same as the target mesh that feeds in here, so it's the box mesh. So let's attach that. We could also take the box mesh from here, drag it in there. So we're basically telling the box mesh component, set the collision from the box mesh, and now we have collision. However, look at this. Now, this might not come through brilliantly in the video, but that projectile is bouncing off the face of the cube. So, in Unreal Engine, there are two types of collision. There is simple collision and there's complex collision. And simple collision is used under certain circumstances, complex is used under others. Right now it's using simple collision. Simple collision builds collision when it's done automatically, I should say. Simple collision tries just to build a box that contains everything. Complex collision tries to follow everything. So, what we want to do, again, you know, I'm just going to tidy this up here. I'm going to pull this over here, and double click to create a reroute node, and one more reroute node isn't going to hurt. There we go. Set complex collision as simple collision. So tell it to use the complex collision in place of the simple collision. I'm a stickler for stuff like this. And now, as the projectile is bouncing around inside that hole, which is pretty cool. So we fixed our collision. So we're one step closer. Right. Let's tidy this up by this over here and saying add complex collision as simple. Okay, so we fixed that. Now, let's add just for the sake of it, so let's just say, and I'm going to add a quick reroute node here. It never hurts to spend some time keeping your blueprint neat and tidy. It's always time that you'll make up later on, because you would lose time trying to figure out what's going on. So, we've got all this. Let's talk about the dynamism of this. So for one thing, this sucks. Like, we put this into the map, and it's just this scene actor. That is no use to anyone. We're also just generating a box mesh here. So, what we really want is we want this to look in here just like any other actor, or any other mesh actor. And then we want to use that mesh here where we're generating the box mesh. So, let's start by, we want to give this a static mesh reference. So let's take the static mesh we want this to look at. Let's call this static mesh. Because there is only one static mesh. Always make sure you think this through, that there is only one of this before you call a variable something like static mesh. We want this to appear in the level editor so that we can actually see what static mesh we've chosen. And the construction script, if you don't already know, the construction script is something that runs in editor. It does also run in the game itself. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to add static mesh component. I'm going to promote this to a variable and call this temp. You might see where I'm going here. Temp static mesh component. because we know we don't want to use this as a static mesh component. And then we're going to set the static mesh for this. Because again, like we said with the dynamic meshes, the static mesh component is not the same as the actual static mesh. It's a component that contains a static mesh. So we take the static mesh, let's get that, let's plug that in there. Let's go back here. This doesn't have a static mesh set at the moment. I'm going to go share. There you go. Missing the flag be used with nanite. If the material asset is not resaved, it may render correctly outside the editor. Don't know that's going to be a problem. And there we go. It is now displaying the chair mesh. Now, if we hit play, you can see the chair mesh is still there and the box mesh is still there. So the first thing we're going to do is going to get rid of the chair. So, let's say on begin play, and let's insert an execution pin before in our sequence. So that we can keep things neat and tidy and separate. I wouldn't always use sequences for stuff, but it makes it easier, especially when I'm talking this through for you guys. So the first thing we want is we want to get rid of the temp static mesh component, which is going to destroy component. So you don't actually need it, it's just a visual effect for within the level. Okay, so I'm going to compile that, run, and we're getting rid of our temp static mesh. Okay, now, what we need to do is, I sometimes find it easier to write in comments what I'm trying to do as a sort of pseudocode and then work towards that. So let's do that now. So we need to generate dynamic mesh from static mesh. So we're going to change this from box mesh to dynamic mesh, or from box mesh component to dynamic mesh component. Again, you know, it's maybe, some people maybe don't like doing that because you've got a dynamic mesh component called dynamic mesh component, but I'm certain we're only going to have one dynamic mesh component that we're using in this. You might feel differently, you might want to name it differently. I'd understand that. So we add a dynamic mesh component. We still want to do that. We want to set that. We still want to get the dynamic mesh. It's this append box that we want to get rid of. Now, again, we could go back to the API. I did happen to see this when scrolling through the API when I first started doing this. But let's do this now. It's like drag off here now. We're dragging off from a dynamic mesh pin. So it's giving us everything that's context sensitive to a dynamic mesh. And I'm going to say static mesh. And would you look at that? Copy mesh from static mesh. So there we go. We're going to take our static mesh, drop that in as the from static mesh. Now we're going to do a little bit of debugging stuff here. I'm going to say success, go to here. And I'm going to pull a failure here into the print string. And say, you know, I'm going to, a little trick that I like to use. I always like to make sure that I know when I see debug text on screen, who it is that's writing that debug text. You might notice I personify actors and systems like this. Partly it's just a manner of speech, but partly it is a mentor of mine is a guy called Gary Penn from Denki. He always used to like to personify systems when he talked about them, because our goal as system designers is to bring digital systems to life and to make them appear lifelike and appear with character and appear with emotion. So it helps to kind of like use the language that puts you in the mindset of what you're supposed to be doing. So we're doing a debug string here. So if it fails the static mesh, I'm going to put in B here, make sure it starts with a space. We'll see why in a sec. Failed to copy from static mesh. You know what, I'm going to put space and I'm going to add another pin. I'm going to get a reference to self here. Plug that into A. We're probably not going to see this, by the way, but this is just helps me with debugging if it throws sensible error messages. So if it fails to copy the mesh from the static mesh, then it will print the string me failed to copy from static mesh and the static mesh. So it'll give me the information I need to know if it goes wrong. Okay, and in theory, that should be us. And you see, we have that static mesh, and that static mesh has been booleaned. And I can shoot through. It's not a material trick, it's not visual. That is actually booleaning that static mesh. However, you'll notice when we set the static mesh before, static mesh components are all set up to pull material information from static meshes. Dynamic meshes do not do that. Or dynamic mesh components do not do that. So, we're going to have to recreate that information, unfortunately. So what we're going to do is, in fact, you know what? I will show you. No, chair. You drop this in, it creates a static mesh component. So you can see static mesh, static mesh, and then materials, and it says element 0. So materials are a list of materials. They can be multiple, and it uses material IDs for those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add here. Now we know we want it to be an array that can hold multiple elements within one variable. Interesting, this caught me by surprise. So if I put in a material here, the problem is a lot of meshes, especially on Unreal, will use material instances. And I would have thought a material instance derives from a material, therefore you can just use the material value. Doesn't work that way. For reasons that I do not understand, but I'm sure make sense to other people, you use a material interface, and the material interface variable type allows you to place materials or material instances in the same array. We're going to call this materials. Now, we're going to go into our construction script here, because just in case these are not the default materials that we use for this, we want to set the materials for... The way that I did this before was to go through the materials using a for each loop. And this is probably an unwieldy way of doing it. It's probably a better way to do it. And then set material, and you'll notice it gives you an element index. So you go there, and you set the material, and that will set your materials. Okay. Well, let's change this to something else. There you go. So setting the materials for the temp mesh. To set the materials here, a good bit easier, because let me drag this out. Just go dynamic mesh component, set, configure material set for dynamic mesh component. Okay. So apologies, that might be an unwieldy way of doing the materials. I'm sure people will have better solutions for me, but it works. And then this is how you configure the material set here. So now, yeah. So we have our dynamic mesh, and we have it with materials, and it is doing the booleaning. So the next step is we just need to make that booleaning dynamic based on it being shot. This seems like a good time to take a break, and I'll see you again for the next part where we're going to do the actual dynamic booleaning of one mesh from another. Okay? As usual, there's all that like and subscribe stuff that helps out with these kind of things, so I'm told. And otherwise, if you do anything cool with this, let me know, drop me a comment. I will see you next time for the next section.